Every year on the 16th of April, people around the world recognise the anniversary of the battle at Culloden. This battle ended the rising led by Charles Edward Stuart and had profound implications in Scotland and elsewhere. If you ever have the chance to be at Culloden on the nearest Saturday to 16th of April, please do so. The gathering that morning, the emotion and the history are well worth sharing. In the section for July and August 1745, we examined the background to the various tensions and events which led to the series of Jacobite risings in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. We told of the build-up to the 1745 rising and the journey of Charles Edward Stuart from Rome to Paris and then to the west coast of Scotland, where he arrived on the 23rd of July 1745. We learned of the gathering at Glenfinnan on the 19th of August and the build-up of Jacobite forces during the remainder of the month, then the beginning of a government response. So how did things progress during the month of September 1745, and would the two armies, so close to meeting at the end of August, finally face each other? At the end of August, the Jacobite army had crossed the Corryarrick Pass and was gathering in Perth. General Cope's army was heading north, having decided to stop the Jacobites from reaching Inverness. There seemed to be little to stop Charles Edward Stuart reaching Edinburgh. During September, we will see a lot of movement by both forces and encouragement for those who hoped for a Stuart victory. In the 6 months from November 1745 to April the next year, Jacobite and government armies would cover a lot of ground in both England and Scotland, and it's worth reminding ourselves of the problems of travelling in the 18th century. In Scotland and the north of England, decent roads were few and far between. In Scotland, both armies made use of the small network of roads created by General Wade to improve communications with government forces. Otherwise, most travel was on tracks and paths used by drovers and other traders. If you look at the maps in General Roy's Military Survey of Scotland from 1747 to 55, you'll see just how sparse the roads were. As the Jacobite army travelled south, they may not have met anything like a decent road till they reached Preston in Lancashire. We need to bear in mind that communications were also difficult in these days, partly because of the issues just mentioned. When you think that the fastest mode of transport was a galloping horse or a ship under full sail, it's not surprising that for much of the time, even in England, both armies had little information about where their enemy was and what they were doing. Trained ravens might have carried messages in the Game of Thrones, but not in 18th century Britain. Intelligence about the enemy's movements continued to be a problem for the Jacobites throughout the Rising. At the beginning of September, King George was again in Hanover, so it was the Lords Justice in London, his delegates, who decided to increase the forces available to meet the Jacobite threat. On the 4th of September, they ordered the Duke of Cumberland to send 10 battalions back to Britain. He was still Commander-in-Chief of the army in Flanders, despite their defeat at Fontenoy in May 1745. These 7,500 men eventually arrived back in Britain on the 23rd of September under the experienced command of General Ligonier. Instructions were also given from London for raising some 20 new regiments, militia companies in 4 northern counties, and later the return of all regiments from mainland Europe. The government was clearly taking the arrival of Charles Edward Stuart and the events in Scotland seriously, but that action was in England, what was going on north of the border. On the 1st of September, the Jacobite army left Blair Athol, now 2,000 strong, and headed for Perth. An advance party of some 300 entered that city on the 3rd, followed by Charles himself on the 4th, and the remainder of his army a day later. News of their arrival encouraged more volunteers to join. By the 11th, the Jacobite army was in Dunblane. They bypassed Stirling and its castle, although they were so close that some defenders of the castle did try some cannon shot, one of which it's claimed landed very close to Prince Charles himself. To go from Perth towards Stirling seems a very long way round for us, because we're used to a fast road across Fife and bridges over the Firth of Forth. But at this time, the lowest bridges across the Forth were at Stirling, and that was right under the guns of the government-held castle. The only crossings before that bridge were ferries, including one near Edinburgh, the Queen's Ferry. And ferries were not the way to transport 2,000 soldiers and all of their followers across a major river. The Jacobites' only option was to follow the north bank of the River Forth till they were well west of Stirling and cross Lair, which they did at the ford of Frew. The crossing of the Forth was a symbolic moment for Charles. He was at last in the Lowlands. No longer was the Rising just a Highland affair. Now they were able to leave Stirling Castle behind them, call at Bannockburn, and turn eastwards towards Linlithgow and Glasgow. Perhaps to confuse government spies and watchers, the Jacobites made a feint towards Glasgow and sent a party to that city to demand that the city fathers hand over all their weapons and some £15,000, which would be over £1 million today. In the event, some £5,500 was collected and returned to Charles. But the diversion did cause panic in Glasgow, which was now growing and prosperous since the 1707 reunification and access to international trade. That fear spread as far south as Dumfries. The defenders of Edinburgh were mustered on September the 15th, knowing that the Jacobite army was close. This had been delayed in part because of the actions or inactions of a Lord Provost called Archibald Stewart, who was their nominal commander. He was clearly of a Jacobite persuasion. A force was gathered of some hundreds, perhaps even over 1,000. This included the town guard, which numbered about 120 men, mainly old soldiers, who acted as a sort of police force. There were some volunteers, members of the Edinburgh Regiment and city militia, known, probably inaccurately, as the Edinburgh Trained Bands. The plan was for this force to leave the city and join up with part of the regular army, the 14th Dragoons, commanded by Colonel Gardner, then to face the Jacobites at Corstorphine. Many of the men declined, perhaps using the excuse that their job was to defend the city from within, not to face the enemy in open country. In the event, only about 180 men marched out to join Gardner. Meanwhile, in Edinburgh Castle, the commanders had asked for reinforcements to ensure that they could hold this important symbol of government power. The city magistrates were asked for a couple of dragoon regiments, but this was refused. In effect, the city itself was abandoned to the Jacobites. Despite this, the castle was held by government troops throughout the Rising. On September the 17th, with no effective resistance, the leaders of the Rising were in Edinburgh, and Charles Edward Stuart took up residence in Holyrood House. General Cope and his army, having missed the Jacobites in the southern Highlands, had decided there was now considerable danger to Edinburgh itself. Instead of staying in Inverness, which had been their original intention, they went east to Aberdeen. Cope had decided that the fastest way to reach Edinburgh, hopefully ahead of Charles, was to take ship from Aberdeen rather than march south through lands which by now could have contained a Jacobite army. They left Inverness on September the 4th and reached Aberdeen on the 11th. After some confusion about how to load the army onto Royal Navy ships which were waiting offshore, they finally left Aberdeen on September the 15th, leaving the city to the Jacobites, and arrived off Dunbar, 50 miles south of Edinburgh, on the 18th, only to find that Charles and the Jacobites had entered Edinburgh the previous day. This is another example of difficulties of travel in the 18th century. 14 days from Inverness to Edinburgh, and we think 4 hours is too long. Having disembarked his forces at Dunbar, General Cope led his army towards Haddington on the 19th and arrived near Prestonpans the next day. In Edinburgh since the 17th, Charles proceeded to establish himself as his father's regent. In that role, he proclaimed James VIII as ruler from Edinburgh Cross, amidst much rejoicing from his followers and supporters in the city. Prince Charles also organised the collection of taxes and other charges from the people and businesses in Edinburgh, just as any ruler would do. And later, earlier in October, he made a declaration rescinding the Union. Tartan favours were much in evidence, and no doubt Jacobites in the city thought that Charles had come to stay. But he had his thoughts further south, and knew that at some time he'd have to face General Cope's army rather than leave this major force at his back. So his men were ordered from the city, and they set off towards Dunbar. The two armies finally faced each other at Prestonpans on September the 21st, after the Jacobite army had travelled from Edinburgh and General Cope's government army had come from Dunbar. The government force numbered some 2,000 men, and the Jacobites probably nearer 2,500. However, neither army had many experienced soldiers. Many of the government troops were recent recruits gathered from a variety of garrisons around about Scotland and northern England. For many of the men of both sides, this was their first experience of mass soldiering. And among the Jacobite leadership, there was certainly some conflict about tactics, partly due to the relationship and competition for influence over the prince between Lord George Murray and Colonel O'Sullivan. Cope lined up his men at Prestonpans in one direction, and several times during the hours before the battle, turned them around as the Jacobites manoeuvred. It's fair to say, after the long march to Aberdeen, the sea voyage, and then a 2-day march to Prestonpans, many of Cope's army would be exhausted and probably hungry. The land at Prestonpans was difficult for an army to control, and it was better understood by the Jacobites. It also had a railway line across it, or should we say a railed wagon way. Horse-drawn wagons were used to take coal from the mines at Tranent to the salt pans in the coastal port. More detail about the battle is readily available, but in summary, it was quickly over when the Jacobites advanced towards the government lines and, using a local guide, made a surprise attack from an unexpected direction. There was an immediate panic amongst many in the army, and a retreat quickly started. The Highland charge has succeeded again, as it had many years ago at Killiecrankie and earlier that year at Fontenoy in Belgium. The Irish Brigade, part of the French army which had defeated Cumberland's force, was instrumental in the outcome of the battle at Prestonpans. The number of dead amongst the government army was comparatively small due to the speed of the retreat and the panic. Reported numbers varied, but somewhere about 150 was probably a good estimate. On the other hand, something like 1,300 prisoners were taken by the Jacobites. Prince Charles had given orders that the prisoners were to be dealt with humanely, their wounds treated, and food provided. He was keen to present himself as a regent for his father James and show that together they were concerned for the welfare of the entire population of Britain. Most of the prisoners were eventually freed, having given their parole that they would not fight against the Jacobites in the future. How many of them would later be willing, or indeed allowed, to keep this promise, we will never know, but it's suspected that many would later find themselves back on the battlefield. And what if the Jacobites had immediately carried on from their victory and proceeded into northern England? Were the government forces so disorganised and shocked by the defeat at Prestonpans that further victories for the Jacobites would have been possible? Those not killed or captured, including Cope himself, fled towards the English border and the city of Berwick. It was said by some that Cope was the first general to deliver news of his defeat in person. Later in 1745, there was a military inquiry into the shambolic defeat at Prestonpans. Cope and two of his senior officers had to face an inquisition. The chairman of the board was Marshal Wade, who was renowned for the many bridges and roads used by both armies as they travelled in Scotland. Not surprisingly, the blame for the defeat was placed not on the officers, but on the ordinary soldiers. Cope and his senior officers were absolved. The victorious Jacobites left Prestonpans and headed back to Edinburgh, where Charles continued to hold court in Holyrood House, and his senior officers set about training their growing army into an effective fighting force. Perhaps recognising that the victory at Prestonpans might have owed more to government failings than their own prowess. Further north, after General Cope and his forces had left Aberdeen on the 11th, the Jacobites took advantage of the fact that the city was undefended and took possession, which they held until February 1746. Would the position at the end of September have been the same if the Jacobites had not been able to overcome the government army at Prestonpans by using their local knowledge? Neither side has a numerical advantage. Would the Highland charge, coupled with poor government tactics and leadership, have been enough to win a more conventional battle without the secret passage? At the end of September, Charles Edward Stuart and the Jacobites controlled virtually all of Scotland, except for a few isolated government garrisons in castles at Edinburgh and Stirling, and also in the forts, including those in the Great Glen.